Okay, it looks like we got a quorum here. Hi, my name is Chris Hallam. I'm the Senior Product Manager for Windows Client Security, and today we're going to talk about the new era of threat resistance on the Windows 10 platform. Just to give you a little scope on what my role is, because security, of course, is a huge topic. My role is related to the Windows client, obviously, and it's the things that are going on inside it, like BitLocker, AppLocker, et cetera. Things like Active Directory, threat management gateway, these types of things that really live in the server world. Those are owned by the server team. So today we'll be talking about the things that go inside Windows to protect against threats, as opposed to some of the server-side components. But you'll find it's pretty interesting nonetheless. So to kind of tee things off, I want to help you understand kind of Microsoft's point of view on how we see the threat landscape, and I think that will set context and help you understand why are we making the investments that we've made in this particular area. And so, our view is really that most of you, to the extent that you can financially within your organizations, have probably deployed the best solutions that the market has to offer, or at least that you can afford. But sadly, that's not good enough in the modern era. Because the security landscape has really changed, and really changed dramatically in the last couple of years. I think starting about 2012, we really saw a dramatic shift. And so the platforms we have in place, the systems we have, whether it's FireEye or Palo Alto, you name the best software out there, you are still going to encounter intruders in your network because the platforms themselves are just not immune to a lot of attacks that are just being replayed again and again. And so we're really dealing with a revolution of cyber threats. And as I mentioned, it's not just an incremental thing we're dealing with, it's something quite substantial. So if we're to do kind of a compare and contrast where we've been, in 2003, 2004, you remember Slammer and Blaster, and the people who did this just wanted to take down a network and see what they could do. They didn't have profit motive. The profit was maybe at least limited to their notoriety, right? To be able to release Blaster got some of these script kiddie type people some notoriety in the community, but they didn't necessarily profit with dollars. But then when we moved to 2005 and beyond, we saw organized crime monetize some of the weaknesses in computer systems. And so we can name all sorts of different interesting things like CryptoLocker and we can Black POS, and we can name all these different instances of malware that were clearly targeted at generating revenue for organized crime units. And we believe that trend doesn't end. That will continue as long as it's possible for them to make money. But what we've seen, I think roughly in 2012 that's very different is that we have nation states getting involved. It's not just a crime organization with a bunch of smart hackers and whatnot. This is teams of highly sophisticated, some of the best trained, best hackers in the world are working for some of the nation states, and they're going after not just other nation states. They're going after private companies like the ones you work on. So we could go through and list all the names, but the attacks that we've seen more recently are more brazen than we've seen in the past. Sony is a perfect example of that. They're complex. But I think that they depend on some fundamental weaknesses in the platform that have existed for a very long time. So I don't think that they're necessarily creating new computer science. I think they're finding new ways to exploit things that have been weak in the systems themselves for a very long time. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But their motives are IP theft, damage and disruption is a new thing. And if we look at Sony, this is where I think there was an aha moment where we all kind of need to step back and really rethink with our CXOs and say, look, we're just inherently vulnerable to a number of attacks, and look what happened to Sony, right? This cost them a lot of money financially. It also cost a lot of people their jobs. So if you remember the emails that were leaked, right? Some of those people are not working at Sony anymore. Those are very embarrassing for the company, and it hurt their brand, right? Consumers have a different point of view about Sony than they did prior to that breach, because those were some very interesting emails if you hadn't read them. The other thing that was interesting about that attack is not only did they try to embarrass the staff, they also went after the consumers of their products. And that's really different, right? This is more like a terror type of act, right? Where citizens of the U.S. here who wanted to go see the Interview movie in a movie theater were threatened with their lives, right? That they could experience a 9/11 event in a movie theater. And so this is a very different type of thing, and I think we're going to see more of it. I can't imagine why we wouldn't see more of it, because those attackers were obviously very successful. Now, if we look at a different type of scenario, we look at the White House. White House is a very different thing, right? You have an organization that has an unlimited budget to protect itself, right? A theory. and it can still get breached. And what's interesting about this attack is it actually started in the State Department. So it starts in the State Department, manages to find its way into the White House. So the ability to move laterally across these networks was possible. And I can only speculate what they did to do that, but I think some of the solutions that we have, particularly in identity, may have been helpful, but again, I'm just kind of speculating. But the point we're making here on this slide is even with the best budget, you cannot defend yourself if you are in the crosshairs of these adversaries. They're gonna get in. And there's lots of easy ways to do it. So let's talk about how we're going to approach solving this problem with Windows 10. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to ruin the attackers, basically their economic model. If we can make it dramatically more expensive for the attackers to be successful, we make it really hard for them to monetize that situation, right? I think that we have a chance at going after the people who do things like CryptoLocker, right? We can do things that make it really, really expensive for them to be successful, and I don't think they have the budget to continue that work potentially. Nation state, different type of situation, right? I don't know if we can break the economics of a nation states, but if we think about the attackers as a pyramid of people, right? Lower sophistication at the bottom and highly sophisticated at the top, maybe we can slice it down the middle and we can get rid of the people who don't have the IQ and the budgets to execute sophisticated attacks, but we'll see. The next thing we need to do is we need to break their playbook. The playbook is actually well known. We have an incredible amount of telemetry data that comes into Microsoft every day. We have hundreds and hundreds of millions of PCs sending information voluntarily to us through our Maps program and some of the others, and we're able to inspect that. We also work with Symantec and McAfee's in concert with them to share information so we can see what kind of attacks are there. And so we actually know very, very clearly how these attacks are used again and again and again. We know the techniques, we know the tactics, we know the tools, and so we can break the playbook with that knowledge. And so that's one part of our solution. The last part is something I think it's going to feel a bit new in Windows. So what we've done, I think, in Windows 7 and prior to that is we've just added more defenses. It was just all about defense in depth. And I'm not saying defense in depth is a bad thing, but there is a limit on how far you can go, right? We need to not just have a bigger, stronger wall on the perimeter, we need the interior to be as strong as the exterior, if you know what I'm talking about here. So we need to have defenses in the platform itself that inherently eliminate the risk factors themselves. Not just a defense to defend us against exploit, but let's make it so that the exploit's not even possible without defenses on the perimeter in some cases. And so we have a great example of a solution that we'll talk about here in a minute that is exactly like that. It's like fundamentally disrupting everything the attackers are doing. So before we get into the meat of all the malware resistance features that we're here to talk about today, I want to give you just a really quick overview on some of the key value proposition for Windows 10. So across all the different domains, identity, data protection, et cetera. So in the Windows 7 world, you're generally using passwords. If you're using two-factor authentication, it's probably very limited. Statistically, very few people are using two-factor everywhere in their network. They protect their VPN and maybe some other assets on the network. The reason why they don't protect everything is because it's too hard. It's too expensive, cumbersome, et cetera. With Windows 10, we have an easy-to-deploy, enterprise-grade solution that's two-factor auth. It's very similar to a smart card, but far more convenient. It doesn't require dongles and readers and all this stuff. It's very similar to a virtual smart card, which we had in 8. The feature's called Microsoft Passport, which is the new credential type. It's based on FIDO, if you know about the FIDO Alliance. This is based on an industry standard that's emerging, and Google's working with us on the design, believe it or not. And then to access your passport, which is your password alternative, you use Windows Hello. If we have time at the end, maybe I can show you a quick demo of what that looks like. But Windows Hello is the biometric unlock mechanism to unlock your PC, get access to the container that has all your credentials so that you can then authenticate using your Microsoft Passport. So this is a big game changer when it comes to identity. We also have a great solution for pass the hash. If you're familiar with that attack, we basically, pass the hash is going to go away with Windows 10, at least on the client. So we can prevent the pass the hash attack from beginning or proliferate from a Windows 10 device with the right hardware. The next thing we want to do is make sure that encryption becomes the default state of PCs. The Windows 7 world is a world where you deploy encryption. You spend a lot of time and effort to make that happen. Maybe use DLP on mobile phones, probably not on desktops. We want to change that. We want to give you DLP on the desktop and on mobile. We want it to be seamlessly integrated in the platform so you're not dealing with funky containers and persona switching and all the stuff you see in some of the solutions that are out there in the marketplace today. And we want to make sure that BitLocker encryption is something that is the default state of the PC. So modern devices running the latest hardware will be, even in the consumer space, automatically encrypted with a version of BitLocker we call device encryption. And that just happens automatically. And if you want to opt out and go with third party, that's still an option, of course. But you're moving to a world where encryption is just part of the platform. So to get closer to what we're really here to talk about today, threat resistance, the key kind of premise of all the malware resistance features we have is based on this. The world you have is a world of hundreds of thousands of new malware threats per day. And that world's a world where your desktop PCs trust everything in the world until McAfee or Symantec or Windows Defender, SCEP, if you're using that, say that's malicious. So what that means there's a patient 0 and there's a patient 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. There's a lot of people get infected before we find out about these new malware variables and release signatures to you. That's why you get signatures all day long. Because it's just constantly trying to keep up with the churn. That's a losing fight. What we need to do, the way we really combat malware on PCs is what we've already done on Windows Phone, and actually iOS does the exact same thing. We need to put the device into a state where it trusts nothing at all until the app can prove that it's trustworthy, right? So that raises the bar really, really high, right? And we'll talk about what that means in detail as we move on. The next thing is on 7, you're used to PCs that really have no security components on them. Maybe it has a TPM. In fact, most of them have TPM at this point. But what we really need is we need a deeper bench of security components to defend us against malware threats, identity theft threats, and these types of things. We need UEFI Secure Boot is a certification requirement for Windows 8 hardware and greater. Secure Boot we'll talk about more later, but that is instrumental, right? If we can't boot Windows with integrity, all bets are off. If you can get under Windows with a bootkit, there's nothing in the world that can save you from that type of infection, except an offline cleaner or something like that, where you boot to a USB and do an offline scan and clean. TPM's required. TPM's been revved to version 2. And then, of course, the new thing for Windows 10, and both of those things initially are related to Windows 8 features, so those are things that are getting carried forward. The thing that's really new with Windows 10 when it comes to hardware is our use of virtualization. So we cannot defend against modern threats if all of our components are sitting inside Windows and they're vulnerable to a case where malware can get system privilege. So as long as we have a world where the kernel can be compromised, we live in a world where our security components will be tampered with and compromised. So if we can use virtualization to protect those components, we can put this system into a state where we're in a completely different place when it comes to protection. So let's go ahead and dive in, and let's start with a little more on the problem set. So as we talked about just a moment ago, the challenge we face today is all the apps in the world are trusted, and until somebody says no, that's not going to be a good idea, and you have some sort of signature that starts blocking things. So what we want to do on Windows 10 with a feature that we call Device Guard is create the conditions so the apps must earn trust. And so Device Guard is the feature that we've talked about. We announced this just a couple weeks ago at RSA, and it's a new approach for defending against malware. It's an approach where the PC doesn't trust anything until an app can prove that it's trustworthy. So that's the ideal mode. This is the strategic direction for malware resistance on Windows. It doesn't mean that AV is not necessary. But we need devices to be put in this type of state, and then when coupled with AV, you get a superset or a broader set of protection. So that's the ideal, and as we talk through Device Guard, you'll see where Device Guard is a perfect fit, and you'll see some cases where maybe some organizations may find that Device Guard's not an ideal fit. Option 2 is the traditional mode, right? Big stack of Windows defenses, an antivirus solution from your favorite vendor, maybe some sort of app control from Bit9 or AppBlocker or something else, maybe use Bromium, right? This big, deep bench of other things. That's the traditional mode. And so we're going to talk about Device Guard first, and I'm going to help you understand what that is on the next couple slides, and then we're going to talk about traditional mode. And traditional mode, all the features that are there actually roll into Device Guard as well. They provide benefits there, as you'll see. So let's go ahead and drill in. So what is Device Guard? Well, basically it puts the device into a state where the PC literally doesn't trust any apps, as I've described, and the apps that are trusted are apps that are signed by a trusted authority. And so what is a trusted authority? Well, a trusted authority is the Windows Store. So when you get an app from the Windows Store, you know a couple things. You know that the vendor has been vetted. You know that the app has been vetted. So we look at it, we run automation against it, and if the app is using certain capabilities or using certain APIs, we actually have people manually take a look. So depending on the level of threat that the app may represent based on what it's doing, we index maybe more analysis versus less, depending on what the app does. So anything from the store gets vetted vendor, we get the app vetted, and then we know the provisioning to your PC comes through a secure channel, it comes from Microsoft, and then that app sits inside of a sandbox that we call the app container, and we know that, you know what, the likelihood that malware can get through all of that gauntlet is pretty low. But that does not going to work for the enterprise. And why is that? It's because most of the apps you care about don't come from the store, right? In fact, almost none of them do for the enterprise. So that's going to change over time. So that's the good news. The Windows Store will become the premier way of getting applications to PCs in the future, and there will be a business version, which we announced earlier this week. But in the meantime, what do we do with the wild west of apps that you have? Well, if your apps are signed, and a lot of apps, like those from Oracle and Siebel Software and Microsoft and Adobe, all the big, tier one types of ISVs, they're all, at this point, all signing their binaries. And so on a DeviceGuard PC, you can choose to to trust that signature. So you configure your PC to say, I trust Adobe, I trust Microsoft, and the long list of other people. And once those signatures are baked into the PC is only capable of running those binaries if they are signed by one of those trusted authorities, and the binaries themselves still have an integrity, meaning that they haven't been tampered with. So that's option 2, which you can use in concert with option 1. Option 3 is for your line of business apps or apps that you get maybe from a solutions integrator. So a lot of those apps, sadly, are not going to be signed. If they are, it's easy. You just say, I trust the signature that this particular line of business app that we built is signed by, or the solutions integrator did. But if it's not signed, what do you do in that case? Well, we've provided a tool that will make it very easy for you, and I think I may have jumped ahead to the next slide. I did. Makes it very easy for you to indirectly sign unsigned binaries. So what does that mean? Well, if you have a list of binaries that are part of an application, you can use a tool that we will provide to you that will allow you to basically analyze those files. We take the list of the files and the hash values for each one of those images or files. We put them in what we call a catalog file, and then we sign the catalog with a signature that can come from us, or it can come from your own PKI infrastructure, or whatever you choose. And then, of course, once you've done that, you then make sure that DeviceGuard is configured to trust that signature, and then that's how we indirectly trust those binaries. So as long as the catalog file that has a hash for the binary that's trying to execute exists and it's signed, then we treat that binary as if it was signed actually physically on the file itself. So this makes it really easy to deal with the world of unsigned apps or signed apps. This on the surface may sound a little bit like whitelisting, and I think to some degree it is, but I think whitelisting in most people's minds is Bit9 or AppLocker. What makes this different than those solutions and far more powerful is this next feature, which we're going to talk about, which is called Hypervisor Code Integrity, which is protected by VSM. So what is a VSM? So as I talked about earlier, we need virtualization extensions to protect certain components away from a kernel that we assume eventually could become compromised. And so some of the components that we can put in there into this separate environment, an environment that is protected by hypervisor, would be things like the code integrity service. And so let me build out my slide here. So what we do with VSM, Virtual Secure Mode, is basically a VM with its own kernel, and within it, we run a series of processes. One of the processes is the local, it's basically the LSAS service. And so the LSAS service is the authentication broker in Windows, and all the NTLM hashes, Kerberos tickets, TGT, all the things, the secrets that are used for authentication are managed by the LSA service. And today, when that LSA service is sitting on the right-hand side in Windows 7 and Windows 8, if the kernel is compromised, I can take control of the authentication process in Windows, and I can access your derived credentials like the NTLM hash, and I can pass the hash, and I can move across your network very easily. And this is a very trivial attack if you're familiar with Mimikatz and whatnot. So pass hash is a huge problem. But when we move this into this process and the data that it uses, the NTLM hashes, into the VSM, right, which is protected by hardware, because we have a type 1 hypervisor that's separating it from Windows. We have a condition where even if the Windows kernel is compromised, it still doesn't have access to that process. It doesn't have any access to the process's data, meaning your NTLM hashes and your Kerberos tickets and your TGT and all these other artifacts that come from the TGT are all equally protected. So through isolation, through using virtualization extensions in hardware, we can provide basically a solution that represents the end of pass the hash as it's currently being implemented, which is I steal the hash and I use it to replay your identity somewhere else. So that's one scenario. The next scenario is virtual TPM, a little outside of the malware resistance space, but I'll mention it since it's the third process we're putting in there. Virtual TPM is pretty obvious what it is. It's a virtual TPM. But what this gives us is the ability to provide TPM services to VMs. So if you've got a bunch of servers in the data center, you've probably asked, wouldn't it be nice if I could use BitLocker on that with the TPM? And you couldn't. Now you can. And then you can also protect certificates and all sorts of other things as well. So the TPM is, when it's virtualized, gives our VMs either on the client, so you're using client Hyper-V or server virtualization, you can use TPM there now. Now, to bring it closer to home when it comes to malware resistance, let's talk about the hypervisor code integrity service. So this is where things get very, very interesting. So with the code integrity service, what does that do? Well, it verifies that the code that Windows wants to start has integrity. It makes sure that it's signed, and if it's signed by a signature, it also makes sure that it hasn't been tampered with. So if you've got a signed binary and somebody's tried to hack on it, code integrity would see that as an integrity violation, and the binary and the image wouldn't execute. So that's what code integrity can do. Now, code integrity can also do another thing in Windows 10 when it's moved into the VSM. It also can be used to control memory allocation. So when we're using VSM, instead of having the kernel allocate memory on behalf of applications, the VSM will do all memory allocation. And so what this means is if the kernel is compromised, it can't tamper with that process. And so where is that interesting? Well, let's imagine that I have an application that's got a 0 day and I run a buffer overrun. What do I need to make that go? Well, it means at the end of the buffer, I need to have writable memory on the other side of that so I can inject my code into memory and then bootstrap my attack. Well, with hypervisor code integrity, it forces a system into a condition where when memory is allocated for a process, the memory is allocated as write, then the data is written to it, and then code integrity turns off write access and makes it execute only. So, or read only, depending on what's necessary for that particular allocation. So what this means is I don't have writable memory anymore for processes, which means I can't do a 0 day. It means I can't do a buffer overrun, because there's no writable memory. I can't inject code into running processes. And even if I can compromise a kernel, I can't change the behavior of the coding integrity service, which is making this all go. Now, from a hardware perspective, you're probably wondering, well, what do I need in my PC to make this all go? I need two extensions on the processor. One is the VTX extension. That's on AMD processors and Intel processors, typically found in the vPro chipset. VTX gives us the ability to have hypervisor. Okay, so I can have a type 1 hypervisor if I got the virtualization extension called VTX. To get this benefit that I talked about, which controls memory allocation and causes creates a condition where memory is always going to either be execute or write after allocation, I need another thing that's a little more rare. It's a little bit more new. It's called VT-D. This is also called Input-Output Memory Management, IOMMU. And so this is what allows us to, using this feature, control memory in a way where we can't have these 0 day types of attacks, at least in the kernel mode space. So VSM is a really dramatic improvement on the system, and through isolation we can create the condition where even if the kernel is compromised, the authentication process, the virtual TPM process, and the code integrity process, which is critical, it's central to Device Guard's functionality, cannot be disabled or altered in its functionality. So we're going to go ahead and do a demo here real quick, and we're going to cross our fingers. We sadly reverted changes on our demo and brought it back to an earlier state in our VM, sadly, right before the meeting. So Brett worked really hard to get it ready, And I think we still have a demo we can show, but let's give it a try here. All right. All right, so we got a couple VMs here, so let me go to the first one. And so this is my Windows 10 box, and this is my Windows 7 PC. All right, so the scenario that we typically see, and sadly I can't show you the fully elaborate scenario with the website, which I broke when I tested this last night, but it starts with an email, right? So we have an email, the phishing email. It arrives in somebody's inbox, it looks authentic, it's got a link to go download the latest expense app or whatever the thing is, but because it looks like it comes from somebody authentic, in this case Contoso or maybe a person you know, a lot of people click on these links. In fact, Google did an analysis on phishing of the Gmail accounts, and if you go look at the report, they said that anywhere from 40 to low single digits, depending on the conditions, of users would be successfully phished. They would successfully click on this link and provide some information on the website destination. So we can assume that a lot of people would receive an email like this and click on it. Now, because I broke the website, I'm just going to run the executable itself. So imagine I go to the website, I click on this download. Oh, it's the Contoso expenses.exe. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and elevate privilege so I can install that. That doesn't seem like a big deal. And then what happens behind the scenes? Of course, Windows Defender is disabled, and probably the firewall and a number of others. This is a very common attack. It happens all the time. Your users will be tricked into clicking on these links, and the stats prove it. So let's talk about Windows 10 with Device Guard. Okay, let's see here. All right, same scenario. I won't click on the email because you know what it looks like, but I will click on the binary. And so what's going to happen here with this binary in this case is not signed, but even if it was signed, because it's not signed by a trusted authority that this device was configured to trust, what will happen is Windows is going to block the execution. And so what we've done, just so you can see that something happened, because if something gets blocked, you're not going to see much. We have kind of an ugly message box right now, just so we can do the demo. And you're going to see when I double click on this binary, because it's not trusted code, what we had happen here is it's violated the code integrity service. So what would happen for users is they would see a much friendlier message, and of course there's eventing in the background, so you can audit this type of action, etc. But this configuration, there's no binary that you can put on this PC that will run unless it's signed by one of these trusted authorities, or you find a really interesting vulnerability in the hypervisor. So, and that's a hardware level hack that we're talking about there. So Device Guard really is going to kind of transform, I think, the whole malware landscape on Windows for the users or the organizations that deploy it. All right, so let's go to the next thing here. All right, so before I move on to the traditional mode, which is a little bit more of a lengthy conversation, let's talk about where Device Guard is going to be really good and maybe more challenging. Like I said, our goal is to have Device Guard on every PC in the world, but because we live in the Wild West of desktop apps, and that just isn't going to work for everybody. It's definitely not going to work for consumers, right? Until we have critical mass in the store with consumer applications, it's hard to imagine Device Guard being provisioned out there. So we will do that in the future, but right now it's definitely targeted for enterprises. And I think the best fit for Device Guard, at least today, are devices that have fewer apps. So if I've got a POS system, an ATM, a kiosk that has a fixed set of apps, it doesn't change much, it is absolutely brain dead to put this on the PC and lock this down in a way where it's ironclad against malware. So we recommend looking at, look at those PCs. Which ones have the least amount of churn from an app perspective? Get Device Guard out on those right away. ATMs, POS is easy, low-hanging fruit. You have no excuse, in my opinion, to not run Device Guard on a PC if it's new and has the right type of hardware. Device Guard might be more challenging in organizations where you let your users download and install anything that they want. Right now, if they're installing a lot of apps that are signed, you could add those signatures to the trust database, and that would work okay. But it could be a lot. I mean, I don't know what your organization is like, but I talked to a gentleman earlier today. He said that they had 30,000 apps running around their network. And so that could be a lot of signatures from a lot of different companies. So maybe take a look at that work that it would take to round that list up and compare that versus what it costs to manage malware that's getting on your PCs, and do the math there and see if it's a worthy investment. So anyway, that's one thing. And then the other thing is, what about unsigned apps? If you have a lot of unsigned apps in your organization, it's not that hard to deal with those. You can use that cataloging tool that I talked about where we sign the catalog and it references your unsigned apps, and that will work. But if those apps are constantly changing, because the hashes will change every time you update the binaries, that means you're gonna have to recatalog this file quite a bit. So if you have a lot of churn in unsigned apps, it can be a little more difficult. So I think each organization will decide for themselves where it's the best fit. I think every organization has sectors within it where Device Guard will be a perfect fit. And I think there's things we can do futuristically to deal with the signing challenge as well. Part of the problem will go away on its own, right? Once the apps are in the Windows Store and they're signed, the issue fixes itself. But that's not gonna happen overnight. So we have the Device Guard option with the tools is the interim thing. So let's talk about traditional approach. And let's talk about device integrity. So the problem we had with Windows 7, and the problem you're dealing with if you're not on 8, is malware is pretty easy for malware to get under the hood. You can have firmware infections, you can have bootkits on PCs, meaning malware that starts before Windows has even started. So you basically tamper with the MBR and the boot sector, and you can have something start before Windows starts. And so typically you get a bootkit like Allurion is a great example. It boots, then it boots Windows under its control. The user has no idea that this is going on, and maybe you have some antivirus can detect it, or maybe not. But the point is, the devices that have BIOS are inherently susceptible to boot and bootkit types of infections. So the solution to this is UEFI. So UEFI, as I mentioned earlier, is a requirement for all Windows 8 certified devices and greater. It protects the firmware on all option ROMs on the PC. If you have an option ROM that allows unsigned firmware to be put inside it, UEFI Secure Boot won't allow that device to start. So if you have some ancient video card that has an option ROM with unsigned firmware, you're not going to be able to use that video card. Now, luckily, that's not a big deal because most things are signed at this point. But it at least gives you that assurance that you're not going to have low-level bootkit sitting inside of the video card, as an example. UEFI Secure Boot also provides another benefit, which is it ensures that the operating system that you want to starts first on the PC. So there's no bypass you can't hack the MBR or change the boot sector to redirect it to another operating system loader. UEFI Secure Boot will only load a trusted operating system loader, and what is that? That's an operating system loader that's signed by Microsoft. So that could be Windows, but it also could be Linux. So if you remember the UEFI Secure Boot when it first came out, there's all sorts of controversy. The Linux community is like, oh, Microsoft's trying to shut out our community. That was not at all the point. We just want to make sure that unsigned bootloaders can't start. And so what we've done with the Linux community is we now, we basically sign their binaries. So we work with Red Hat and all the ones that you can name, and they give their bootloader to us. We sign it with a signature that's trusted, and then it can boot. But you can also add your own signatures to the UEFI Secure Boot too. So if you have your own custom bootloader and you want to start that, you can sign it, add it to the UEFI database, and you can even start those. So anyway, Secure Boot is a great way to ensure that the device has at least firmware integrity, and that you know that Windows, if that's what you want to start, will start on the PC. The next thing we have is a feature called TPM that typically we associate that with BitLocker. BitLocker, of course, is a disk encryption feature, and so you're probably wondering, well, how's that relevant to device integrity? BitLocker has these things called PCRs. PCRs basically allow us to measure certain components of the system, such as the UEFI firmware and the option ROM firmware and the bootloader, and so we can take measurements of all these interesting components as they boot, and then we can store those measurements on the PC. And that's kind of where the story kind of stops with TPM. But what you can do from there is you can add what we call a remote attestation service, and that data can be harvested, and those measurements of, say, the UEFI firmware could be compared in the cloud, for instance, or something on-prem with a list of known good firmware, UEFI firmware instances, or a list of known good Microsoft bootloaders. And the reason why we need this is if you remember the Flame virus is a virus or malware that was deployed in a nuclear facility in Iran, but what they did to circumvent security is they managed to get a Microsoft signature and they signed one of their malicious binaries, and that defeated some of the systems they had in place. So we have to assume that our signatures will be breached, although we've changed our practices so that we will better protect them, and hopefully that would never happen again. But again, that assume breach mentality needs to occur even with these systems, because if all we're doing is trusting signatures, we know one day somebody's signature, it may not be Microsoft's, maybe somebody else's, will be compromised. So we need something like a trust but verify system that TPM can give us. So the next thing we need platform integrity. And so when Windows boots the system, or excuse me, when UEFI Secure Boot allows the Windows bootloader to start because it's signed and has integrity, the first process that starts in Windows is something we call Trusted Boot. Trusted Boot is a process that protects the remainder of the boot process. So all of our kernel mode drivers, and pretty much everything all the way to the Windows sign-in is protected by Trusted Boot. So only signed Microsoft code can start there. But there is one exception. We have a special socket in the Trusted Boot process. I may have a bullet there on it. I don't. But there's a socket in this boot process called ELAM, Early Launch or Early Load Anti-Malware. So McAfee and Symantec and Windows Defender, if they submit their anti-malware driver to us, we will sign it. And then when it's signed, it can start first before any other Windows user mode code starts, and it can also start before, in theory, any other malware, because we have Secure Boot making sure that Windows starts, then we got Trusted Boot making sure that just Windows signed drivers start, then we got the anti-malware driver starting before any third-party malware, which means it's really hard to get in front of the anti-malware solution and turn it off. Not a foolproof solution, but it's a pretty good solution, and it's already paying pretty big dividends. The next thing we're doing is we're isolating certain components. We talked a little bit about that with VSM. VSM is a way of isolating certain parts of the Windows system core. Some components aren't a good fit for VSM, but we have another feature that protects them when they're not in the VSM. We call that protected processes. So protected processes, basically it's a special way of signing a process, and it creates a condition where a process that's not signed with the same signature can inject code and can't tamper with that process. So a lot of the Windows components in Windows 10 have been brought in this protected process zone, so it's much more difficult than ever on Windows 10 to tamper with core system components. And then the last thing I want to mention is kind of related to that TPM functionality I mentioned on the last slide. We have a cloud service called Provable PC Health. Provable PC Health shipped in Windows 8.1, and what it does is it takes a look at the boot integrity data, all that data we talked about that the TPM is analyzing and measuring. That can get sent up to the cloud, and then the cloud can compare it versus known good values, and in the event that you have the Flame version 2 on your PC, our cloud would know about it almost instantly. And then we would be able to send messages down to the PC indicating, or even an email to the user saying that, hey, we've actually detected a low-level boot infection. Here's how you should go remediate. Now, the Provable PC Health feature in Windows 10 has been enhanced to provide jailbreak-like protection. And that's been coupled with the conditional access features that the Intune and the MDM community is working on. So conditional access, which we talk about at the very end, is the notion of preventing devices from having access until they can verify that they have a healthy state. So that's platform integrity. Let's talk about once I boot, I know Windows is in a healthy state, hopefully. What about the app security and these types of things? Well, we know that there's a lot of 0 days out there that we've experienced in the past. The good news is most of those aren't in Windows. Most of them are actually in some of the plugins that run inside browsers. But anyway, we know that more will be discovered, because as long as we have human beings writing code, we know that more defects will ship. It's just it's how it works. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have mitigations in place that create the condition where even if somebody does make a mistake and they leave themselves vulnerable to exploit, that we can prevent the exploit from being successful. And so technologies like ALSR, DEP have been around a long time. But until Windows 8, they were barely used in Windows. You could opt in to use those in applications. Some parts of Windows used ALSR and DEP, which is a way of, ALSR is what randomizes memory, makes it very difficult for an attacker to find an interesting place to insert their malicious code. And then DEP is a feature that allows you to say, these parts of my memory allocation are execute, these ones are read-only, and that kind of narrows the surface area where attackers could inject malicious stuff. But those features were not applied everywhere in Windows really until Windows 8. And the reason why is it turned out we had a lot of hard-coded pointers in our product, and so randomizing memory just broke Windows. And so it really took until Windows 8 until we could fully apply these systems that have been around since 6 XP to the whole system. But we did more than just apply it everywhere. We also increased the level of entropy. So entropy is think of that as a level of randomization. And randomization is not a binary. It's not just random or not. There's actually increasing range or gradient of randomization. It can be better or it can be worse. We went from about 8 bits of entropy up to 32 bits of entropy with Windows 8, depending on the feature area. And if you do the math on that, if you got your calculator, you'll know that that means it's really, really hard to find the spot, right, or to predict where the memory was actually laid out. So people can figure it out. It's a lot harder now when you increase the level of entropy. There's a new feature, which I'll go ahead and go to the next slide to talk about. So this slide here just kind of talks about the history of mitigations. Starting with, prior to 2003, with XP, we added DEP and a couple things. We had in Vista, we had ALSR. 8, we talked about some of the improvements we made there. In 10, we have a new feature that is incredibly dramatic in its ability to deal with threats. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of telemetry data. We know how we're being attacked. And what we found is, browsers are one of the main exploit paths into Windows because they're running plugins and these types of things. And so what we found is when we looked at the attacks is we found that they were using this attack type called use after free, which is for the people who are developers in the house, you'll know what that means. But basically it's where you hijack memory that's been used in the past and you put your own code in this area that's still being referenced. But what we can do now with a feature that we call Control Flow Guard is we can, within an app, control the flow of it so that malware can't deviate the app flow. So your applications that are developed, that are running your organization, have a natural path of activity, right? This pointer or this function allows you to go from here to there, and it's all predictable, right? Well, attackers sometimes can hijack that process and can cause a function that would never be called by another to be called by another. And then you can cause some interesting things to happen. So through Control Flow Guard, we can enforce that the application behavior can never deviate the developer's actual intent. So we basically harden the application, and we call that Control Flow Guard. Control Flow Guard breaks 96, I think my next slide might have a data point. It's not there. It breaks over 96% of the exploits that were used in the browser since 2011. So think of all the exploits that we've seen in the browser, and one feature breaks 96% of those. So this is going to be a big deal, and the attackers will find new ways, but again, we're just making it harder and more expensive to go after your device. So Windows 10 is just vastly more secure against vulnerabilities than anything that predates it. We did great work in 8, so 8's way better than Vista and 7, obviously, but 8 and 10 are something you need to get to deal with the exploits that you're experiencing right now. The next thing that we've done, and we did this basically in Windows 8, is we moved to a model of app containment. So in Windows Phone, we had a feature called the Chamber. It was rebranded to App Container, and App Container is just a fancy name for a sandbox. So when you develop apps, or when ISVs develop apps that take advantage of our new Universal App Runtime, those apps inherently are able to take advantage of a sandbox. And that sandbox, by the way, is pretty good. If you go look up Pwn2Own from earlier this year, if you're familiar with Pwn2Own, it's a hacking competition, and teams get together and they attack different systems. One of the systems they attacked was the iOS, Android, and the Windows Phone sandbox, and the Windows Phone sandbox was the only one that was still standing at the end of that. So we think we've got some great work there when it comes to sandboxing, and sandboxing really is the future of apps. Win32 apps are hard to sandbox because they're designed in a way where they assume that they have access to admin credentials, and they just behave very differently. So you can't just easily throw those in a sandbox. You can use solutions like Bromium. Bromium is a great solution out there, but even those can run into some challenges related to when you persist data. If you're in a site, a virtualized container, and you try to persist data, it kind of violates the motion of virtualization, right? You want to make sure you can spin something up and tear it down. And so persisting data when you're using those products can be somewhat challenging. But at any rate, as we move to the world towards universal apps, which we believe will happen because we're giving away Windows 10 for free for a year, And Terry Myerson promised, our president said, we're going to have 1 billion Windows 10 clients. It's going to create huge demand for universal apps because we'll have a great marketplace. It's actually easier to develop universal apps, and when you develop a universal app, you get an app that works great on the tablet, works great on the desktop, and it works great on the phone. So if you're using Windows Phone, you have this app that has the full functionality that you have on the desktop, and we've got this really intelligent UI that hides features and can bring them back to the surface based on how you navigate through the app. So universal apps and the sandboxing are a big deal. If we had sandboxed apps across everything on Windows, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation because most of the malware threats would be effectively mitigated. So let's talk about one last thing, and I think this is going to be really interesting for you, for those of you thinking about moving to 10 or worried about, what are the deployment implications from a security product standpoint? What about AV, et cetera? So with Microsoft platform changes like XP to Vista, Vista to 7, Microsoft has a long history of breaking third-party AV. That's not something we do intentionally, but it's something that happens, and here's the reason why. A lot of people don't realize. It's not because we're not maintaining great app compatibility, although sometimes that is the case. The real challenge is that third-party antivirus solutions typically do undocumented things to do the amazing antivirus work that they do. So they're not using Windows APIs to do all of their work. It'd be great if they did. If they did, we wouldn't have app compatibility challenges, at least to the extent that we have. What they're doing is they're doing all sorts of interesting things. They're going directly into memory, looking at things, making assumptions based on the way we lay out memory, what we're doing. They're doing all sorts of undocumented things, and so what happens is when we change the platform, guess what? Everything changes. If they're using an undocumented way to do something, very likely it breaks. So that's the problem we're in with third-party AV. But we have to have a solution, and so a solution that we weren't willing to do in the past was build the rich platform API set that they wanted. And in Windows 10, we're not willing to do that either, actually. But what we were willing to do is we were willing to give them very, very low-level access to very low-level events in the system. So instead of giving them a path to go directly into memory to look and inspect things, we've given them a very rich eventing channel that they can look at the events, and based on their feedback, and we've added the events that they want, they effectively have what is technically not an API, but will feel like an API from an app compatibility perspective. So as McAfee and Symantec rev their products to Windows 10 compatible versions, and they move to this eventing channel that we call the secure event channel, we are going to be in a mode where as we move forward and change Windows very rapidly, you're not going to be constantly finding your antivirus solution to break. So this is good news. But the important thing is the existing solutions out there are not using this eventing channel. It requires them to update their product to use this channel. And once done, then I think we're going to see great or comparatively great app compatibility with the AV moving forward. All right. So let's talk a little bit about online safety. Windows Defender is a solution that we've had in the box. It emerged out of Security Essentials, so it's been out there for quite a while. Windows Defender is now in client and in server. So with Windows 8, we added it to the client. It was no longer a download that you went and got on your own. It was just baked into Windows 8, but now it's also baked into Windows 8. So it's there automatically for you, and the user will always be protected with AV. And so that's an important point here. So today what we see is an environment where there's a high percentage, depending on whose numbers you look at, it could be into the teens of PCs that are not protected with an anti-malware solution, either because it's been compromised with malware or it's expired. A lot of brand new PCs come with a trial edition and then it expires and the user doesn't resubscribe. And so what we've done in Windows 10 is we've added code that will detect if the third-party anti-malware solution is not present, then Windows Defender will be running. If the third-party anti-malware solution is not functional or currently subscribed, so it's not up to date, after 3 days of the PC being in this state, we will automatically turn Windows Defender. And on the road to that third day, we will provide warnings and, please resubscribe to McAfee, and we'll try to bring the user back to the solution that they started with. But at the end of the day, if they choose not to, we're going to protect the PC with Windows Defender, because that's better than having an inoperable AV in our view. So the next thing we're going to do with Defender is we're going to leverage the power of the cloud. I mentioned that a little bit earlier very briefly. The key thing that we're doing there is we're leveraging context from the PC. So when we encounter new binaries and images appearing on the PC, the context, meaning the origin of where it came from, did it come from email or was it an IM or did it come from USB, and a number of other contextual variables, we can assess those, and using the context, we can determine how likely that is to be a threat. So what we do today is we treat everything the same, right? But with context, we can say, you know what, that thing is more likely to be malware because of the pathway it's arrived on the PC. So using context and the power of the cloud to help us analyze this context will create the condition we think where Windows Defender will be able to provide potentially even superior protection versus some of the other things out there in the marketplace. Another thing that we're doing in that same space is we're actually making a deeper investment in the research side of things. So Windows Defender, if you look at AV Test and the comparatives out there that compare Defender versus others, we're not in the top 5. We actually do pretty well. I mean, if you look at quantify the number of malware types that we haven't detected in these tests, and you then look at how many people are affected by those, what we're missing is malware that is impacting very, very low percentages of people, which is why we're not prioritizing delivery of signatures. But at the end of the day, the reality is our view, based on your feedback, is that it's not good enough to be number 5 or 6 or whatever we are right now, even if very few people are running into challenges with being infected with stuff we've missed. But what we've done is we're committed to moving to the top, and so we've improved the staffing on the team. We're going to have them prioritize some of these signatures. So if you're looking at AV Test as a measure on whether you should use an anti-malware solution, the team, which has just recently spun up, I think will be able to produce results that should bring us into a really good state competitively, maybe within the Windows 10 timeframe when we ship. But we'll see how fast that team can spin up and be productive. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is our commitment to Windows Defender, our commitment to SCEP, and kind of a new vigor in our approach to delivering great results there. The last thing I want to mention is that when it comes to resilience and recovery, we have 2 features that are important. We have something called Protect the Guard. On Windows 8, it's difficult to turn off AV. On Windows 7, as you saw in the demo, it's really easy to turn off AV. In Windows 10, I can't promise it's impossible to turn off the antivirus solution, but it is going to be really, really extraordinarily hard compared to what we're experiencing today. And so we basically have created the condition where Defender just has to be running, kind of like the kernel has to be running for the system. And so I can't promise there's no bypasses for that, but our ability to protect Windows Defender and also third parties is dramatic, because this solution isn't just for us. This protection will also be offered to third parties. So they'll be able to submit their AV solutions to us, kind of like we did with the ELAM driver. They'll be able to submit other parts of their program so that we can harden it in a way where it's very, very difficult to turn off. So AV tampering is, I can't say it's a thing of the past, but the bar just got extremely high. All right, so let's talk about IE. So a lot of people think about IE and they're like, wow, IE has a lot of vulnerabilities, and I'm very concerned, but it's really not IE that's a problem, and we'll get to the real problem on the next slide. But this shows you on the left-hand side, when we move up vertically, this is the number of different versions of IE are kind of out there and commonplace in the marketplace. The orange bars represent a vulnerability that was discovered and the number of browsers of IE versions that were affected. So back in 2006, 7, and 8, we had a lot of problems. 2009, we had a good year. 10, we had an issue. We kind of throttled a little bit back and forth. But I think we finally got our stride with SDL, which is the Secure Development Lifecycle, around 2011-ish. And since then, we really haven't had any vulnerabilities in the browser, or zero-day exploits is actually what I should say. There have been vulnerabilities, but there haven't been like zero-day exploits, so there's a little difference there. There was one moment in 2014 where there was. If you heard about something called Sailboat, Sailboat is the code name. I think it made it out there on the internet, but you'll remember there was a vulnerability in IE that I think it was like almost the day after we said we're no longer supporting XP. This vulnerability was discovered in the browser. And even though we promised we would never patch XP again, we decided to patch XP for this bug. And it was because it was so easy to exploit that vulnerability and do remote code execution that we broke our rule, we patched to XP. But the important thing here is if you were running enhanced protected mode in Internet Explorer, meaning you're running Windows 8, you actually weren't susceptible to that vulnerability. So we still patched it on 8, But if you're running in, enhanced protected mode or running in the sandbox, that vulnerability didn't matter. So in Windows 10, we really haven't experienced, or excuse me, Windows 8, we haven't experienced any at this point that were relevant if you got enhanced protected mode turned on. Enhanced protected mode, incidentally, was turned on by default when we shipped 8. It was turned off based on customer feedback. Windows 10 is turned on by default. The problem with enhanced protected mode is there were some app compatibility issues. We've worked through those, and now it's back on by the default. So that's going to give you a sandbox that makes vulnerabilities less likely to be exploitable. So let's talk about the real problem in the browser. So the real problem in the browser, whether it's Chrome or IE or Firefox, is the plugins that are running on it, or in it, you might say. And so this stack chart here, this gives you the total volume of, threat detections based on Flash, Java, et cetera. And you'll see that Java was ruling the roost on 9/1/2014, and Flash was in second place. And you'll see that IE is a vulnerability source is not listed at all, which makes sense based on the previous slide. So it's really these plugins that are a problem. So what we decided to do is look at, well, what's wrong with these plugins? Is Java just fundamentally problematic? No, actually. The problem with Java is nobody patches it. And so that's a problem, right? So you have 0-day forever on a lot of versions of Java out there, because people in the consumer market particularly, maybe not so much in the commercial space, we probably do keep these things up to date, but in the consumer space, it is 0-day forever on a lot of these things. So what we did is we introduced Java blocking, which doesn't mean we block Java. I should change that. But it basically means that out-of-date Java, highly vulnerable versions of Java, will not be allowed to run in the browser. Once we introduced that, you'll see that the attackers quickly went, I don't have a fertile ground anymore. I need to go find another way to attack systems. And so now all they do is they work on Flash. So we can do the same thing with Flash, and we're working with Adobe to kind of navigate through the logistics there. But I think that we're in a place where we can do that, and I think you'll see, when you combine URL reputation, safer plugins in the browser, you can see, I think, that this is going to be dramatically more secure than what you're experiencing on Windows 7. So I think this is the last couple slides here, and then we'll take some questions. So today, when your PCs connect to your network, it's pretty much assumed, at least in most organizations, that device is healthy. Right? There's no vetting that when you connect to the network, in most cases. Some people deploy NAP for certain scenarios, but most organizations do not. So unhealthy PCs connect to your network, and what do? They proliferate malware across your network, right? So I just asked for access, and now I'm in. There's no vetting. So with Windows 10, we're investing in a feature area we call conditional access, and so I mentioned that feature, Provable PC Health. And so Provable PC Health is a cloud service. And I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the next slide and show you the image, which I think better explains what I'm going to talk about. So today, when you move to the Provable PC Health world, what's going to happen is a management solution like Intune or AirWatch or Mobile Iron will be the decision maker on whether you're going to gain access to resources. So before you get access to a file server, Intune's going to say yes or no, right? So it's going to become like a gateway. So what will happen is your PC is going to attempt to connect to a resource, and you're going to be challenged. It's going to be challenged. You need to prove to me that you're healthy. So the client will then go up to the cloud and say, I need a way of getting my health vetted. Please, Provable PC Health, please analyze my health state, take a look at my measured boot data, take a look at my secure boot state, and let me know how things are going. The cloud will then push down what we call a claim, which will either be healthy or not healthy. The claim is just a ticket saying, hey, this is the health state of this PC, and it's cryptographically generated and protected, so it can't be man in the middle and these types of things. But it's sent down to the client. The client then passes that to Intune, and Intune says, hey, looks like your boot integrity is good, but I actually want to check a few other things. And so Intune, as an example, and AirWatch and Mobile Iron maybe do something different, but they'll probably do something similar, is Intune will check your AV status. Or is AV running? Are signatures up to date? Is the firewall running? Am I at the right patch state level? So it sounds a lot like NAP, but it's better. And from an engineering standpoint or from an architectural standpoint, this gives us a better path, because we have not just patch state data, but we also have integrity data, which is something that NAP wasn't engineered for, and I don't think we could go there. NAP, which is a feature some of you heard of, architecture was a dead end, and so that's why we stopped working on it, and we shifted our effort towards the Approvable PC Health Cloud Service and the conditional access stuff we're doing on 10. So NAP just is kind of reconfigured in a new way, and this will give us a path forward that we can build on and make it even stronger. So there you have it. That's Windows 10 threat resistance, and I have I guess we got about 10 minutes left for questions, so if you want to come up to the microphones, I'll be happy to answer any. Go ahead.
So I have a couple of questions regarding the hypervisor and VSM.
Mm-hmm.
Will this feature be enabled by the mic?
It's fading in and out. I can repeat the question while we work on the mic.
Okay, so will the hypervisor and the VSM be enabled?
Maybe if you speak directly to the mic, I think that might.
Okay, so the hypervisor and the VSM, will this feature be enabled by default on all devices running Windows 10, which support virtualization?
The answer is maybe. So let me explain. So you have to configure the image in a way that will allow the VSM to spin up. So if you just ran through a default, like a consumer grade install, and it would not. So you need to prep the system. You need to make sure that the virtualization extensions are actually configured and enabled in the hardware. And so you may actually, depending on the configuration of the PC, you may need to have physical possession of the PC to configure the extensions to be enabled, and then there is an imaging process to do that. I need to do, just to be fully transparent, I need to actually take some time with the engineering team to find out if after a PC is deployed, would I have to can I configure the VSM from the desktop, reboot it, and put the VSM in place? At this point, I'm not sure if that's possible. I believe it's an imaging time thing, but I'll know more probably. In fact, I'll tell you when I'll know more. We're writing a white paper on this that will be released roughly in the end of June, and so this answer will certainly be answered there.
And what hypervisor are we talking about? Is it Hyper-V?
It is Hyper-V, yeah, so it's a type 1 hypervisor that we spin up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Got number 4 there.
So actually I have 2 questions. The first one is, there is some processors from Intel, like some of the low-end Adams, and then obviously all the AMD processors that are not going to support ETX.
Yep.
So I'm curious what the thoughts are on supporting a VSM type model with those. Obviously there's a dependency on VTX today. And then I think the second question that's sort of related to that is, what are your thoughts on how technology like VSM can be leveraged in situations where you have nested VMM support? Is that something you're working with Intel on VMCS shadowing to enable those use cases, or is that beyond the scope of what you're looking at right now?
So the first question related to just availability of the extensions themselves. I can't speak directly for Intel, but I can tell you what they've signaled to me in a way that's publicly ready. They've signaled that they would like to see those extensions move into a broader range of processors. Today it's a vPro thing generally. It's in some Atom processors, but I'm not sure if it's pervasive on all of them. But they want to spin it up and make it widespread, or at least more so than today. Whether that moves down into Pentium or Celeron processors, that I don't know, but at least in the mainstream processor lines, I think they intend to go more broad. And then as far as nesting, basically nesting of virtual, hypervisor, that's actually something that we're talking about and definitely contemplating, because I think that the obvious thing you may be thinking about is like, oh, if I have a VSM on a type 1 hypervisor, I can't run VMware anymore in parallel. So to mitigate that, obviously we need to look at things like nesting is a solution for that, but we don't have any announcements on that. But I can tell you that we're definitely thinking about it, because we want to make sure that VMware customers don't choose not to use VSM because they lack the nesting feature that they would need for that. Did that answer your question? Great. I'm sorry? Okay, all right. Well, I'll go ahead and maybe we can talk some more about that, but let's go on to the next question. Going right here.
Yeah, for the enhanced mitigation tool, the Emmet tool
yeah.
that you currently have, where does that fit in with Windows 10? Is that something that you can still run on Windows 10 to provide additional protection, or is it kind of rolled into Windows 10 partly? Or?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Emmet, Enhanced Mitigation Toolkit, is typically been designed to deal with legacy applications that can't be rebuilt to take advantage of ALSR and DEP and some other things. And there's mitigations that go above and beyond that, but that was kind of at least where it started. So our goal or our strategy for Emmet is to bring that technology and put it in Windows as much as possible, and to use Emmet as almost like an incubation center. Like, hey, here's a technique that's maybe not ready for prime time, but it provides some benefit, and let's let users use it in an unsupported way. So I think that trend will continue. So Emmet, I think, has a life there. I think, though, as legacy apps age out of the ecosystem, its usefulness will become less, because that's really what it was primarily designed for. I think the question that begs for me, and this is actually something we're working on as soon as we get back from Ignite, is if I'm using Device Guard, and I've got VT-D, and I've got my IOMMU feature, protecting memory, do I need Emmet anymore? And so I asked that question to the engineering team. They're like, we're not quite ready to answer that question because we don't want to be hasty, and so we're going to do an analysis when we get back and find out, can we say that Emmet isn't useful on Device Guard? We'll see. On non-Device Guard PCs, it provides the same value that it does on 10, basically. So, great. Question right there?
Yeah, I was wondering, is Windows 10 going to natively support the use of virtual smart cards with things like TPM or other authentication methods?
It will. So we continue. So we had Windows 8.1. Windows 8 shipped virtual smart card support. So we can do a PIN using the TPM. We protect the certificate that you provision via your management solution, like Interseed or whatever it is. So we continue to support that, but the strategy moving forward is actually different than virtual smart cards. Virtual smart cards were a great starting point, but they're actually very limited. And they're limited in a number of ways, two of which, there's three. One is the access method to the credential itself is gated on a PIN, and so that doesn't leave room for biometrics, which we think is the future. It requires PKI, and small businesses and consumers are not going to be supported by PKI, and even enterprises who use PKI can't find a way to use two-factor everywhere, so that's limiting. And then the third thing is, and this isn't applicable to virtual smart cards, well, it is actually. So the third thing is the form factor. Some organizations want the credential to not be on the device I'm signing into. They want the credential to be off of the device. And I think there's even some government regulation depending on what you're working on. I think if you're working on classified systems, maybe you actually need physical separation of the PC and the credential store. So like a CAC card or a physical smart card would satisfy that need. But so what we want to do in 10 is deal with all the weaknesses of virtual smart cards and physical smart cards and RSA tokens, all these other things. And we have a new feature called Microsoft Passport, which under the hood feels very much like a physical smart card. So it can be PKI based. I can use a PIN to unlock it, but I can do a couple other things. I can use biometrics to unlock access to the identity, the certificate and my private key, or I can not use certificates at all, and I can use something we'll call key-based auth. So the challenge with PKI is there's assumption that your PKI infrastructure will never get owned, but we know that will happen and has happened and will continue to. So it's a single point of failure from an identity perspective. So what if we had the PCs themselves, which have all this great technology? We've got TPM, we've got Windows 10. Why don't we just generate our own unique key pair locally, secure it to the device using the TPM so it can never be stolen? So it's a lot like a physical smart card. It's not a chip, but it's the TPM that provides the same service as a chip for binding it to the device. And now I don't have to deal with PKI. And so that's what Microsoft Passport is about. It's about going to the next level, and the huge benefit will be, PKI can't scale to the interwebs. Consumers will never be able to take advantage of a smart card, but Microsoft Passport meets all the requirements of the enterprise, and it's consumer ready because it's electronically provisionable. And so Microsoft Passport is based on the work of the FIDO Alliance. And for those of you who know the FIDO Alliance is a working group. It has 200 plus members, and on the board is Microsoft and Google, and we're working together on the passports, our implementation of the FIDO ideas, but we're working together on what those ideas are. So it's effectively based on an emerging standard, and so for that reason, we're going to have a great auth situation that works for Google, works for Microsoft, and we're not going to have fragmented auth, which would be a disaster. Yeah, thank you. Any more questions right there?
Hi. On the Java blocking feature, is there any granularity there? I know a lot of third-party apps require older versions. So I don't want to break them, but I'd love to block Java.
Yeah, you know what? That's a great question. I actually don't have an answer to it. I don't think that Microsoft is totally in control. I think there are some controls that allow you to say, well, even though it's not recommended by Microsoft, at least we allow it. You can also decide where Java can run, right? You can make it run only on-prem, and so I'm sure based on that, you could say, hey, we allow all versions on-prem, but when we move to the web, then we respect Microsoft's guidance there. But I'm not sure on the policy and the knobs, so sorry I don't have a complete answer.
Thank you.
Okay, that might be it. So anyway, thanks for coming. I hope that you found it interesting, and if you haven't joined the Insider program, please do and start flighting the builds. The build that just came out last week, 74, for me, just giving you a little insider information, this was the first build where I'm like, okay, finally it's all coming together. The features are starting to feel rich and complete. There's still lots of bugs, obviously, but it's something I would definitely recommend for a lot of people to start testing. It has a lot of the features we talked about. VSM's not in there, by the way, yet. That will come later. In fact, most of the security features, incidentally, really kind of arrive towards the end of the product cycle. So sadly, you'll be flighting those later, but at least you can test out the experience and a lot of the management features even today. So thank you.